Hello, I'm Ann Wheelis. I'm the coordinator of health and prevention programs at the Monterey County Office of Education. Today, on our Living Legends program, we're speaking with Elgie Bellizio, who is the founder of Sunrise House in Salinas. And we want Elgie to tell us how and why and what went into the process of creating this organization which serves young people and their families in Salinas and Monterey County. So how did it start, Elgie?
Well, interesting, and I'm happy to share it. In the 60s, somewhere in 1966, 67, several of our young people got involved with smoking marijuana, and as a result of that, they were arrested. And they were students in our Salinas Union High School district, and their situation came up before the board, and the board asked the superintendent, now that this happened, what are we going to do? What do we have to offer these young people that got arrested? And the superintendent, explained we had some things going on in the school, like, showing films and what have you, and board wasn't too pleased with that, and asked the superintendent to think about something we might be able to do. And so he figured that we wanted some teacher. I've been a teacher in the Salinas Union High School district since the 1950-51 school year. Started at Salinas High and then transferred over to El Sal Junior High, teaching physical education and science. And I was one of the names I guess they considered. He asked me about it, and I had nothing to offer kids in this field, drug field, and I rejected the offer. And for some reason they kept after me. I had done a number of things with young people through the YMCA with High Sierra camps and things like that. And so he called me back and asked me again if I would do it. And I said no, I didn't. Again, I didn't have anything to offer. He says, well, what do you think you would want for this job? And I said, well, I don't know anything. I need to learn, a lot of learning. I want to have one semester to be able to do that. I'm relieved of my teaching assignment, then I'll come back the second semester, because as a teacher, if I go out and learn all the facts and come back and give all those facts to kids, naturally they'll quit using drugs. That's not the way it's supposed to work. And so they took it to the board, and I said, I want a district card in my availability because I was going to travel, and took it to the board, and the board gave them permission to have me released for a semester. The opportunity to serve in this capacity, I needed to know a lot of different things, because my feeling was that if I'm going to be a resource for our kids, then I had to have information that was accurate, up to date, so that I could answer the questions that young people had about this whole new drug thing. I needed to have information about what would happen to them if they overdose, what would happen to them if they got arrested, what would happen to them if they came under the influence of a drug that might have really caused some health problems for them. So I needed a lot of information. And fortunately for me, I was able to have the support of the community. And the way we went about that, and was, I didn't know what to really do other than the fact I needed to know about drugs. So having a conversation with a couple of pharmacologists from the University of California at San Francisco Hospital, they shared with me a lot of information about drugs, and they turned me on to working as a volunteer at the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, so I could learn what are drugs, what happens when you overdose, what happens if you freak out on LSD, all the stuff that around that. So I had that knowledge to be able to share with others in the school district too. And law enforcement was an extremely important partner in terms of sharing with me. I was able to go along on when they had raids. I sat in the car while they did their thing, but got a chance to see how that operates and what happens to everybody. So I try to get as much knowledge as I could, so when kids ask me a question, I'd have an answer for them. As I started to get the knowledge of how to work with kids and drugs, it got so large in terms of the numbers. It was started to be a 7-day-a-week, 24-hour job. And talking with the superintendent, I said, you know, we need to do something because I cannot do this by one person. He said, so what do you have in mind? I said, I haven't got the slightest idea, but what I do need, I need to have another semester so I can continue to study this thing, which I got, and come back and recommend to the district what we ought to do. And the way I chose to do that was to have the superintendent and the city manager at that time get together, write a letter to all of the agencies in the Salinas community that I felt had a responsibility to our young people. So it was all the law enforcement agencies, it was all the schools, it was the city of Salinas, it was the county of Monterey, through the mental health department, the media, and we all sat around a big conference table. I reported on what I was finding, what things that I was seeing, and maybe some ideas. And so as we went around the table, the city manager said, I think the city of Salinas would be interested in making some kind of a contribution to this, whatever it is that we're going to do. And so they put $5,000 on the table, and we're running around the circle, and everybody put something in the pot. Superintendent said, since Elgie's already working in this district, we'll just put him in the pot as our contribution. Mm-hmm. He's still a teacher, but he'll be our contribution to a joint powers agreement. Mm-hmm. That's how we formed Sunrise House. I ended up that night with $41,900 in myself to start a program, like some type of community program, school community program. I didn't have that answer, and since it involved young people, I needed to go to young people. And not just one or two or a half a dozen. I got the permission of and a lot of good, fine teachers who were interested in this area. All the government teachers at the high schools let me speak to their government class to talk to the kids about what I was doing, what I was intending to do, what kinds of needs they had around this area and other areas, needs of young people, and all the ninth graders in the English class, and all the seventh graders in the elementary school, in our junior high program. So they gave me a lot of ideas about what we should do. Mm-hmm. And I kind of listed those on the blackboard and went back to the Joint Powers group, and I said, this is what our young people are saying. I said, let's do it. So we started to put together a group of young people representing all of our schools. So we needed a location, looked around for a location, ended up with a vacant home over on Cayuga Street over here. And it had been vacant for a long time, and the pigeons had gone down into the chimney and had made their deposits on all the carpets in the house. So when we opened the house, it didn't look like it had carpet; it just had this snow look to it. Well, the group of young people that formed that morning when we got together, it was a large group of eager young people wanting to do something. So we got, buckets of water and soap and brushes, and they brushed and brushed and brushed, and we uncovered a beautiful gold, very expensive looking carpet underneath all the pigeon drippings. And we broke for a morning break, and we were sitting in the living room of the home. And the official name of Sunrise House was the Salinas Area Youth Drug Information Center, because all of the agencies wanted to have some part of the title. And the young people said, that's not a name for a place. So it happened, the sun was coming up, shining right through the front window, right on the kids. And one of the kids said, look at that sun on this house. And then another one said, hey, Sunrise House, let's call it Sunrise House. So they went around the room, everybody said, right on, it's Sunrise House. So that's how it got its name. This is the original Sunrise House. Of course, it's just across the street from the sheriff's department. I think what made Sunrise House unique was the fact that we came together with all the people that I mentioned that had responsibility, and they took an interest in it. because they did have a responsibility and were serious about doing something around the situation. And the fact that they all were willing to contribute something, nobody asked them for an amount. They just threw something in the pot. And it was up to me to, try to develop a program around the resources that were available to me. And so we opened a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week center that young people and their families could come there, or our staff members could go to the homes.
So you train students to become peer educators, and that's part of the whole program.
Jim does this. He's doing the same thing with staff that he has here.
Yeah.
So they can go in and do some of the stuff. And this particular one is she's demonstrating the cycle of a drug.
Oh, that you told us about.
Yeah, that I told you about. That talk about what happens rather than standing up and doing that other typical stuff. It was not just drugs, it was everything that happens with young people, running away. During the social revolution of the 60s, there was an awful lot of young people that hit the road. Yeah. I can recall, Ann, one day when I showed up as a volunteer at Tate Ashbury Free Clinic, I parked my car and there was a long line. It was about 3 blocks long. So when I went upstairs to the clinic, I asked the doctor, I said, Dr. Smith, I said, what's happening? Why are all those kids on the street? He said, it's payday. I said, what do you mean it's payday? He said, it's the first of the month. The kids are all getting their checks from home. Just stay in San Francisco. Don't come home and embarrass the family. So every first of the month, this is what was happening. It was part of a difficult thing to understand with all the changes that were occurring. It was overwhelming for an awful lot of parents, adults in general. And it certainly was for me, but I remembered with what my good friends, the pharmacologists, said when I left them, to make sure I don't pick up a book on the pharmacology of drug for 30 days, to try to find out what's happening with kids. What is this movement? Why are all these changes occurring? And what's the result of this? So there were a lot of runaways that we work with, not only Salinas runaways, but from the Bay Area to Big Sur, the kids it was almost a steady stream. Well, they'd get picked up by the sheriff's department or the police department, and then they'd bring them to Sunrise House. And many times we'd feed them, and then they'd be on their way the next day kind of thing, just to get them off the highway. So it took an awful lot of cooperation with the Salinas Police Department and the Sheriff's Department and the District Attorney's Office. The program got a lot of credibility and support from the important people in these agencies. And I think that's what made Sunrise House unique, in the sense that we don't know whether Sunrise House should exist for a second year. So along about January, February, the board directors, who made up of one person from each of the sponsoring agencies, we'd sit down and I'd give them a report on what we saw and what we did, and what does it look like, what are the student surveys saying, should we go on for another year? Because I was a firm believer, and I still am to this day, if there's not a need for the program, it should not exist. It should phase out. We don't do that in this society very often. But there's, the community needs to support it if there's a genuine need. If the need has been solved, rather than shifting into another program to keep staff working, it was always understanding with staff that when they came to work, it was for the year that they were in. And maybe there would be a second year. Well, now it's been open since 1970 in terms of the time, and it's unique in that sense. I don't know of another program in the country that, with this model, that has lasted as long as Sunrise House has lasted. And again, I think it's due to the nature of the partnerships between all of the agencies. And it's always, as I mentioned, it's always been founded on not what Elgie Bellizio thinks good for kids, what do kids need? Then it becomes my job to try to provide those services to meet the needs of young people so they stay out of trouble and they get the education they need and the parents get the skills they need to be able to make things work. So it's a whole series of things. community, again, provides some services, and the families and the young people work together with the schools to try to provide the services so kids can continue their education and be successful. One of the things that happens to us in the society is when we got around this drug thing is if you use drug, you're a bad person. Somehow, if a young person started to smoke marijuana, they were deficient some way, psychologically, and that's just not true at all. And so if you begin to look at them that way and treat them that way, then as a sick person, then you're not going to get very much in terms of being helpful to young people. So it didn't make any difference to me what drug the kid used. I didn't want him to use any other drugs. And I certainly didn't want him to run away from home or any of those things. But by the same token, if they do, then I felt it was my responsibility and the school's responsibility to provide the services we need to make sure we get things going again in a positive way for that family.
And that's
it was hard times for us in those days in terms of communities dealing with the issue. I've been in 38 states and working with schools and community groups and law enforcement groups to, in terms of trying to help them take a look at some of the things that we can do. And many of the programs never start with the needs of young people. They start with the adults' perception of what kids need. Mm-hmm. And it's usually 180 degrees off target. Mm-hmm. And so if you don't do that and do the perception that the parents have about what they see as their needs, to help educate them about what this is all about. So through a series of many coffee clutches, sitting down with moms and dads and talking about, kids smoking marijuana, if, what happens if your kid gets involved, do you throw them out? Do you turn them over to law enforcement? We needed to have some policies in place that were helpful and not throw them out. Is that I'm a firm believer that every child is a diamond in the rough. We just haven't uncovered that diamond yet, but it's there. And because of the pressure of schools, in terms of academic achievement, they don't have a lot of opportunities to work with kids in those issues. And they certainly don't have the opportunity very often to do the whole business of follow up with families and go into family homes and sit down with parents and help them develop some skills to help make the family system work. If the family system works, kids will go to school and kids get an education. If it's dysfunctional in terms of you can't get together, then nothing works. Everything falls apart, and then the blame game starts, and which results in everything negative, nothing positive. So,
yeah, I like what you say about the diamond in the rough and working with young people to. It's a strengths-based, an asset-based philosophy instead of that negative, kids are no good philosophy.
Yeah, and you have to be, there have to be rules. There's no ifs and buts about that. You can't come to school smoking dope, and you can't play basketball for me if I'm a basketball coach. If you want to make some dope, I'm not going to put you down for smoking dope. What I'm saying is, as a teacher, whatever is the subject matter I'm teaching, I have no skills to teach through a drug. Mm-hmm. And if I'm standing before a class of kids, and some of them are loaded in that classroom, and let them sitting there, I'm sending a very strong message that you can learn through a drug, and that's just not so. And so it's important not to use. And teachers in schools need to be but you don't have to kill them in the process. The zero tolerance insanity that's going on in this country doesn't work. I haven't seen the research. I look at a lot of research, every year. I still do. And I just don't see it. I don't see that yes, you got to hold them accountable. And yes, if a kid's coming to school, getting loaded every day, can't function in school, they don't belong in school. But you don't throw them out. You try to direct them to some services, just as you would in your family. If your kid gets sick, you provide the services for them to get the services they need to make them okay. And you have to do that with drugs also, in terms of, but the vast majority of kids that experiment with drugs go through it and they're out. And those that continue, those kids that have never seen a drug they didn't like, they're going to have trouble. Eventually it will begin to take its toll. But the vast majority of kids, they're not sick and they don't need special treatment and they don't need any of that kind of stuff that people like to profess, and you don't certainly have to lock them up and those kinds of things. That the vast majority of them, I can name hundreds and hundreds of kids in this community that are now in every profession, education, law enforcement. I've got ex-students in this community. They were beautiful kids. They get into the social scene, so to speak.
And when Sunrise House works with alcohol too.
Yes.
A lot of people don't think of alcohol as being a drug.
Oh yeah.
And it's part of the services that are needed.
Yeah. And the other thing that got us in trouble, and still gets us in trouble, is the difference between drug use and drug abuse. That when you talk about drugs, when you talk about a drug, if your sense is it's drug abuse, you're already missed a target. Because there's a world of difference between use and abuse. But if the message is abuse is always, any kind of use is abuse, then you're going to strike out. And the other thing that happens to us education-wise, is we try to educate every kid the same way. If I got a class of 30 students, the research tells me probably 10 of those kids come from families that have a drug dependency problem, alcohol or other drugs. They need a special program. You can't give them. Then you got kids that have never used. And good basic information is very effective for those kids. It enforces the non-use. And then you got the experimenters from experimentation to dependency. Information doesn't do any good there, very little good. So you need the other kinds of services for them. But what we've done historically is we put them all in the same group and give them all the same message, and we strike out with the majority of kids in the classroom.
And are we really good at giving the proper message, or are we trying to scare them?
No. Basically, most of the education is indoctrination. It's not education. And I'm looking at folders. Kids need to know, I can give you all the danger signs in the world. That doesn't change my experience anyway, as a teacher and as somebody working with kids and drugs and other kinds of behaviors, that it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. But if I can sit down with a kid and talk about if they're drinking, and I got interested in drugs and athletics way back when, knowing that we weren't doing very much in the arena. Nobody wanted to touch it. And so I began to do a lot of training with coaches around the country to get them, because next to the parent, the coach is probably the most important person in the kid's life, because they have something kids want, and I can take it away from them. So they have a real big reason here that they can use to do some education. You need to talk to them about, as it relates to their goals, what is it that you're attempting to do, and how do they see what it is? And most kids don't experiment because of peer pressure. They experiment because they're in social settings, other kinds of settings, that they see these things going on and they put pressure on themselves. It's not somebody doing it to them. Right. So whenever you read stuff, it's always kids are doing it because of peer pressure. Oh, there might be a very small, but it's the internal pressure that. So if I don't have the skills to deal with that internal pressure, then yeah, I'm probably very vulnerable to use something.
I like what Dad. I always think that peers are maligned, and I'm convinced that there is a lot of societal creation of that peer pressure. And they do that through advertising, through the media, in alcohol, because of the fact that you never see a party without alcohol, even if kids are present.
Yeah.
There's always a party with alcohol. The availability is there. Kids are often in families where, as you've said, alcohol is a problem, or they'd rather their kids use alcohol or smoke tobacco rather than use marijuana or another drug because they're legal drugs as opposed to illegal drugs.
You see, and I'm not totally convinced over the years counseling with kids and working in the field that all the advertising and all the other kind of stuff, again, it's what is it that I want? If I'm going to smoke dope, what is it? It's like I always kind of use a symbolic kind of thing like a funnel, you know, and if you're smoking grass and down, what do you want coming down at the bottom over here? See, if you say to me, I want to be the biggest head in town, then I can accept that. You know, you got a clear goal. But if you're not sure what you want then how come you're doing it? And if you're going to go to school 5 or 6 hours a day, you're putting the time into the top of this funnel. What is it you want to come out of? Do you want to be known as the guy or the gal that gets 7 straight Fs? You know, if you're clear on that, that's okay. Crazy thing to do, but at least you're clear about what your goal is. But if you're not thinking through these things to see where all this is going, see, that's what I want to do. And then use the information in terms of what happens with the body, in terms of what happens with the brain, but not to say, if you smoke grass, this, and this is going to happen, because that's not the way it goes. It may or may not. I can remember sitting when I was working at the Ashbury Free Clinic, I'd get introduced to some of the young people, and they'd go to Golden Gate Park. Well, I wanted to learn about marijuana. What does marijuana do? I wasn't going to use it because I felt my own life experiences that I didn't need to smoke grass to understand what people are doing with grass, but I needed to understand people. That's the problem. So I'd go to Golden Gate Park and sit in circles of young people, and they're all smoking marijuana. And so I'm saying, well, what do you experience? You know, I'm listening to them talk to me. You know, they're carrying on conversations. If some of them are chain smoking grass, usually 3 or 4 in a row, over a period of half hour, 45 minutes, and they're pretty much out of the loop of education, of giving very valid information. They're in another world by themselves. You know, they're not contributing much to the group process. So to talk about that rather than, if you do this happens. That's not the way in real life it happens. Yes, you may down here, you may certainly end up with a severe problem down here. Not to say it's not going to happen. It certainly is. We got plenty of proof of that. But we need a lot of education. You need interactive learning, where kids are the ones that ask the questions they need the answers for. And my job was to facilitate that process, rather than stand before them and give them all the facts. See, and that's what Dr. Myers was saying to me in San Francisco, the pharmacologist. He says, learn about what's going on with young people and use the facts sparingly. That's not the issue. See, everybody knows they're dangerous. We've bombarded kids for years and years and years, and they still continue to use. Right. Even though the numbers are shorter. And you know, I'm happy to say that if adults, parents, teachers, coaches, give the kids a standard by which to live their life with significant adults in their life, they may experiment once or twice and they're gone. They're out of it. They don't continue to use. In the case of a coach, if there's a good relationship, if it's not a winning at all cost coach, it has to be a coach that's not a winning at all cost coach, because they're the worst drug educators there are. They're enablers, you know, in terms of using. But if you do that with a young person, even when they're at a party and the liquor's there or the cigarettes are there or whatever, the kid looks at that and he says, if they've got that strong relationship with their parents, they say, you know, it's not worth it. I don't want to risk the relationship with my coach, with my God, with my parents, with significant adults in their life. And they won't use. It's not giving them a lecture about the dangers of the drug. It's talking about relationships and trust and integrity and all those kinds of things. Because I don't know who you are. Because one of the things drugs do, when you talk to drug users, all you have to ask them, did you tell your parents about the fact you're using drugs when they ask you? No. Then you've already lied. You've already changed your value around honesty. It changes your values. Pretty soon you don't know what you stand for because it's a con game. That doesn't make you bad. It just makes you a con to protect a behavior that's unacceptable to the significant adults in your life. We opened the door, we started putting together the pieces in 1969 and opened the doors in July of 1970. And then when I retired from the school district in 1990, then I retired from Sunrise House. I've been in a district for 39 years and felt that's probably long enough. And with Sunrise House, I felt that was long enough too, that, you know, things were going along pretty well. And if you get a good person in and continue, the board was still, the interesting part was, you can see the board was always, the board along with the students were the decision makers. It wasn't me, it was asking the students if the service is still, we listed all the, you know, every year when I went back, I'd list the services on the board. This is how many runaways we saw, and this is how many drug overdoses we saw, and what drugs, and all these kinds of things. Have the kids look at that, and I said, okay, now what are your needs, you know, today, because, you know, things change, and we'd look at it, and typically what would happen when I leave a classroom and say, right on, Mr. Bellizio, just keep it going. Very seldom did they have it changed from the original format by the kids. So then the board would look at that and say, yeah, you know, it's still a worthwhile program, let's go another year. What was always understanding, just one more year. But that doesn't mean you don't plan, and doesn't mean you give up, and doesn't mean you're short-termers. You work right to the end if it's the end, because the needs of young people are always there. They're not going to go away because you're going to close a program down. And communities are really remiss when they don't really use the vast majority of young people as the best resource they've got to get the information they need to develop the services that will reduce drug use and gangs and whatever it is that you're doing, and not to make any of those problems different. You know, and one of the things we've done in this profession is fragment everything. Your sexual abuse case and somebody else's, a drug case and somebody else. Well, gee, I can't do sexual abuse, I can do drug, but no. If you're somebody that works with kids, you should be able to work with any problem that's on the table. Any problem a kid brings to you. There's a message there. If you come to me, you know, oh God, sexual abuse, that's my own hang-up, I need to refer you. So many times kids look and say, my God, the guy's been doing this for 10 years. My problem must be so unique, there's no help for me.
But my experience is that it never becomes a success without some barriers and problems and glitches along the way. Do you have some stories to share?
Well, in the very beginning, when I first got this assignment, I'm pretty straight-laced person. You know, I have a long military background, so I'm discipline-oriented and what have you. And when I first started, there were a number of people, I guess, in every community, certainly were in the Salinas community, that were really very afraid and had a lot of fears about drugs. They imagined a lot of things that were going to happen to their kids around the drug use kind of thing. So they were very difficult to deal with in a sense. I was the person representing that fear that they had. And they did a number of things to try to put obstacles in my path so that we would not do the things that we were doing, that they feared. But it took time to go through that, and doing small groups with parents, and eventually over time they developed. But they made a film strip of me with showing me as the playing the flute, taking the kids and lined up behind me, all marching into the ocean, and they would ask me questions about some topic like, do you think it's going to rain tomorrow? And I'd say no, and the next time I heard that question, it said, Mr. Bellizio, do you think marijuana is dangerous? And the answer was, no, I don't think so. They pasted and cut, and they did a lot of stuff in the early 70s that really were. They didn't stop me, because I've always known that the way when I look at the continuum of people, that I know there's always going to be 20% that are just way over on the edge. They'll do anything for kids. They love kids. Nobody has to ask them for anything. They just do it. Then there's 60%. Hopefully we can move that 60% over in the 20. And then there's another group over here, another 20% or so, that I don't know of any way to move them. And so I respect the right to be there, but I'm going to move on, because this group over here is the group I want to work with. And if you're happy, I'm happy to have you join that group, but I'm not going to spend all my time trying to convince you to move over here, because that takes time away from doing the things that I'm supposed to be doing, and that's working with kids and their families.
And I imagine they were afraid, because we still hear this about family life education and sex education.
Yeah.
They were afraid that if you were talking about drugs, that would encourage kids to use drugs.
If you just mention it, you don't mention it at all. No, yeah, and that fear is unwanted. If you're the type of teacher or educator that does the indoctrination, and this is one of the problems that some of the education programs had, when I served on several state committees and national committees in the 70s and until about the middle 80s, all over this country, we were doing things crazy in terms of the kinds of stuff that we were trying to do with kids in these programs. And we didn't realize, in most programs didn't realize how difficult it is for a parent. See, drugs scared the living daylights out of them, because we always had this reefer madness craziness. Drugs are dangerous. They're all dangerous. There isn't a drug that's not dangerous. In the right set of circumstances, with the right drug, a cigarette can kill you just as easy as any other drug. I just think of my own father, who was driving at night, and he smoked cigars, and he was going over a little canal, and he struck a match on the steering wheel, and that light blinded him, and he ran into the wall of that bridge and crashed on the other side of the bridge. So the question is, when somebody asks you what is the most dangerous drug, it really doesn't make any difference. The right combination was he was smoking, he had not been smoking, he never struck the match, never had the accident. So what difference is whatever drug it is? They all have the potential for danger, whether they're prescription drugs, whether they're drugs on the street, whatever. Drug is a drug. And one of the things I learned early on, I don't have any fear for drugs. I have fear in the sense that what can happen, but they're not something that I'm fearful of. Drugs are drugs. They're going to be around forever and have been around forever. Put them in their proper perspective and do the things you need to do to make sure people understand what it is that they're doing, and we can move on. But we made it a scapegoat for a lot of things. We made it a scapegoat for zero tolerance, and just a whole series of things that have not proven. We've spent billions of dollars on programs, and I read programs many years in Washington, D.C., schools that applied for grants. I read grants for their programs. I read for drugs on a school campus legislation, all kinds of, and I just watched millions and millions of dollars go down the tubes. Dean Martin and Jack Webb were friends of a volunteer we had at Sunrise House. And she told them about, in her association with them, told them about what we were doing at Sunrise House. She was a volunteer, and so they made a contribution to Sunrise House and sent a picture along. Can't remember what they said on staff. Best wishes always, Dean Martin. And even in our community, when we get, and I've always had this thing about, and I read in the newspaper today, I guess it was, that every agency that's dealing with gangs wants more money.
Mm-hmm.
Now prove to me, show me the research that says pour more money into it to solve the problem.
Yeah.
It's not money, it's not a money issue. Yes, you need money, but you gotta have the pieces in place. The money's not gonna do any good. And if you get a federal grant for $3 million or $6 million for 3 years, at the end of 3 years, everything you've done is beautiful. Everything works. It's reduced the rates and everything else. The feds say no more money. Now you turn to your community and say, okay, we need $3 million. Now where are you going to get $3 million from cities and the county to continue these programs?
Nowadays.
See, and it's really a rip-off of communities to bring federal money and start programs and services and then have to bail out at the end of 3 years because the money's not there. Why do you start if you can't complete? So if you're going to use federal funds, use them to see if there's a piece that you've put in place has a chance to work,
Yeah.
but not to fund the program. You know, roads, yes, and pipelines, yes, and whatever, you know, in terms of the infrastructure type thing. But when you're talking about people problems, it's a community problem. Drugs are a community problem, just like gangs are a community problem, like, you know, all the young people or problems are community problems. And they have to be solved in the community. They're not going to be solved in Washington, D.C. or Sacramento. And so Sunrise House never looked to the outside. One time we put the first gang worker on one of our school campuses. So the small grant, we wanted to see if it would work. So we put a counselor on the school campus along with a probation officer who taught a class first period in the day that we funded to see if we could reduce the number of absentees and the use of drugs by a very high-risk group of youngsters that were on probation. And it worked beautifully in terms. It didn't take a lot of money. But we have, you know, change administration, change the emphasis. And it's, and again, and I just, every time I see we don't have the money issue, it just infuriates me in terms of where is the dedication to the problems and the needs of people, not whether we can provide them with services kind of stuff. So I don't know, that may be a weird interpretation of it all, but I've seen enough and read enough and worked enough to know that many of those things, I don't have the answers, but any of those things are you know, false impressions of success for a problem you think you got the answer to.
And it's not money, and you're right. The
Yeah.
federal government now for the drug prevention education and alcohol prevention education in the schools, now if you use the federal money, you have to use a research validator program.
Sure.
They've come to learn that.
Sure. But see, the reason that happened was that the schools got the money,
Yeah.
didn't know what they were going to do with the money, so, well, let's see, we're short 2 supervisors, so we can justify it, they work with kids with drugs. So you got, so with that, the rip-off of those funds was universal.
All over the country.
I recommended several programs that I read and that I was liaison to by the Department of Education, saying don't fund these programs. They're not doing what they say they're doing. They're work programs. If you want for people to work, that's great, but not with this money. This is, I don't blame the federal government for pulling out, the funds. They should have never had the funds to start with when you look at the design of the program. Program didn't have a chance of working from the get-go, and yet they fund them. Because you have a certain amount of money that you put in this pot, you got to spend it. I can remember the days flying in the Navy, we And along about March, we run out of funds. We couldn't. We just had enough gas to fly, enough to get our time in April, and in May, and then all of a sudden, the first couple of weeks in June, everything we flew night and day, because we had to spend
the money.
Had to spend the money.
Give it back.
Or give it back.
Yes.
Just that kind of insanity. The whole planning process. So there's a lot that goes into it. It's not as simple as it likes to be. And again, as I mentioned, when I see the articles, both nationally and locally, with what the solution is more money. That's I don't know where you get that craziness, but.
Well, Elgie, I used to.
Just want to let you know we have 13 minutes left.
13 minutes left. Okay. And what's?
So just
Yeah, hopefully they will.
Yes.
to cover the topics.
Okay. Because there's two questions I want to ask. I want to get a little feel of your Navy experience and how that might have contributed to what you did with Sunrise House, and then you and I really first started working together with the Parts Project,
Right.
and so it's almost like that's a way of instead of using money, let's use the other resources that are available
Yeah.
in the community to try to tackle the problem of alcohol abuse from a different angle.
Yeah. So when we looked at the research, and that's important, you got to look at the research. What does the research say of all the data we've collected? What does it say? We got to take time to look at that. What does it say? And of all of that, what are the pieces that have some relationship to what we're trying to do? For example, we know the availability of alcohol increases use.
Mm-hmm.
That's, the research is abundantly clear. So if you're going to develop a program to reduce the trauma around alcohol, you've got to reduce the availability. That's, very simple matter. And if you're going to reduce young people's driving automobiles around the use of alcohol, you're going to have to do some things in the environment to change the availability for young people to get their alcohol. And adults have to understand that, even though it's legal for them to use. It's not something that young people need to do at their ages. But all those pieces, the city ordinances, you look at the city ordinances and, you want somebody with a liquor license wants to sell till 2 o'clock in the morning. Well, when you look at it, now who would buy a 6-pack at 2 o'clock in the morning? We don't have a lot of factories in Salinas Valley where you have shifts, swing shifts and all this kind of stuff. So if you're open at 12 o'clock and at 2 o'clock in the morning, the availability is probably going to be for the people that already have had too much. Mm-hmm. Or are looking to rip somebody off. So why do you want to expose that to a community? You don't need to do that. It's not going to put anybody out of business. Mm-hmm. But again, the availability in the environment does cause an increase in all the trauma in terms of accidents, and death, and injuries, and all the other kind of stuff that goes with it. So I knew, and along with the other people like yourself, that was another area we had to work in. You have to work at the community level, change some of the things in the community that create a situation for these things to happen. It's not because I'm a teetotaler. It's not because I think people shouldn't drink, that kind of thing. That wasn't the intent at all. It was to take a look at what were the relationships between what the research was saying and what we do in Salinas. Mm-hmm. In terms of our businesses.
And that's part of your sense that adults need to be responsible.
Sure.
And take responsibility.
That's right.
Did Salinas ever pass a host law? The kind of law that holds adults responsible if there's a keg party in their home?
Not really, that I know of. One of the things we did again with businesses, we, in terms of offered the education for the bartenders to recognize when somebody's had too much to drink and what to do about that, and drug dealing and all those kinds of things. Try to encourage parents that really don't offer the alcohol, have a lot of parties, good parties, and then the kids say, a lot of the kids say the same thing. They don't need a drink to have a good time. It's something you pick up, but it's in terms of the advertisement. If you're going to have fun, you know, just the Super Bowl is a classic example. You know, you see every bar in the country, everybody having a ball, taking their clothes off and doing whatever they do at the party. You know. So there is a tremendous responsibility. And again, you can't separate yourself from it because it's a school problem or it's a law enforcement problem. It's a community problem. Everybody has a hand in that. But see, we don't do enough of that. We get together and say we got to write a grant. Why do you need the grant? Well, we got a gang problem. Well, okay, so we'll write a grant. Now, how does that solve the gang problem? You're saying we don't have the answer. Well, we need more black and whites, or we need more this, or we need more of those. Well, how do you know you need more of those? Where's the research that says if you put more of these in this box over here, you're not going to have these problems anymore? You can't, and that's what you do when you don't look at the research and plan, you know, plan for long term down the road. What is likely to happen? I knew from working in Haight-Ashbury, I could tell you what drug was coming to Salinas next. Mm-hmm. We were usually 6 to 8 weeks behind the Bay Area. So if we saw Mexican Reds, for an example, in the Haight-Ashbury, with that population, the high drug-using population, I knew it was coming to Salinas. So what did I need to do? I needed to make sure I had the education to deal with somebody that overdosed on a depressant. Mm-hmm. So when a kid falls to sleep in his English class at school X and the teacher can't wake the kid up, you got a medical problem due to a depressant overdose. You got to deal with it. Right. You know, you don't, or you're going to lose the kid. Yeah. So I was always trying to stay ahead of, and I got accused because I did that. I got accused of turning kids on to new drugs coming to Salinas by taking the precautions to train and whatever. But I never felt that, and I've never had kids tell me, Mr. Bellizio, you turned us on. I've never had anybody tell me that. And, you know, I'll give them the information, and then it's their choice. Mm-hmm. And I know they're going to make the choice that I don't want them to make. And when steroids hit, and when I was commissioner of athletics, then it became another type of drug problem for me, and it became all the other drugs too, in terms of drugs that athletes would use that we needed training. So I became part of the state team that when we had the first training we had was marijuana and cocaine and amphetamines. We had the workshops, the 10 state workshops that we put on for coaches and teachers and other people. And then when the steroid thing hit, and we encountered steroids in Salinas in 1982, 83. It was not new for us. We'd already gone through all the stuff that they're talking about now. Mm-hmm. And so we did education, we got information out, we cautioned people. We sent a little pamphlet out to every parent in the district explaining what it is and what it does and what to look for and all those kinds of things. So that's part of the whole planning process. You can't eliminate those problems, and so the planning says what's likely to happen, let's deal with it. Don't say, oh, it's terrible. That's or if we talk about it, they're all going to start using. That's, again, I don't see the research that indicates that that's what happens. Young people are not dumb. I can remember I was on a panel at one time, man, with 7 psychiatrists down in Southern California in Malibu. And here I am, the teacher on the panel on Malibu, right on the beach. Auditorium full of people. All 7 psychiatrists are saying, and I'm not putting down psychiatrists, but your kid's got a problem with smoking dope, you need to come and see one of us. Then it comes down to me sitting at the end of the table asking me about it. I said, well, I don't happen to believe the kids smoke dope have deep, dark psychological problems. They just smoke dope. Now, yeah, if they continue over whatever time it takes for it to develop in the body, because every drug affects the body, yeah, you can have some problem. But to say that if a kid, your child goes out and he drinks a drink, a beer, or has a joint, and comes home, that you need to send him to a psychiatrist. And of course, I got a huge applause from the audience for that. But I believe that. I just, and if you work with kids and you listen to what they're saying, and that's one of the problems, we don't listen to what they're saying before you start any program. You ought to listen to what they're saying, then begin to put the pieces together. But we rush because of the funding cycles, we rush into things. Well, I've always felt everything I tried to do, Ann, I try to do the best of my ability and give it a shot. Is that nobody was never ever going to outwork me or whatever, out-prepare themselves what they were going to do. And I always felt very comfortable in terms of what I did. So when I finish the Sunrise House, for example, I walk away feeling very good about what I did. And hopefully somebody will come in and do it better. That doesn't frighten me at all. I think still the most important thing I can say to any adult or any agency that's providing services, and even if they're not providing services for every community, listen to what the young people are saying. It doesn't mean you have to agree with everything, but listen to what they're saying, and you need a cross-section of your community. You can't just take West Salinas or North Salinas or whatever. You need a cross-section of the young people in your community, because you got to work with all of them, and what one group does affects what another group is going to do or suffer or whatever, in the case of gang and these kinds of things. But without listening to them, you really don't have a starting place. You have an adult perception of the world, and that perception doesn't mean, it's just a perception. It doesn't mean it's accurate in terms of what you're trying to do or going to get you the results you want. But it's just a perception, and young people's perceptions is the other thing. Is you can't challenge a young person's perception, or any person's perception for that matter. So if I want to change it, I can't order you to change it. I can't beat you to change it. What I need to do, my job then as a teacher, is I have to provide more information and more education so that they can make a different choice about that perception.
And to keep on listening to them.
Yeah, but if I fight them on those two steps, then I lose.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there.
I'm intrigued by this picture here.
That's Bert Talcott. He was a lawyer here in town and commissioner of athletics. And I can't remember what we were doing. We were looking at some kind of a flyer, and I can't see what's on
I can't see what. Looks like an anti-drug poster of some kind.
Some sort,
Don't blow it. And then I guess that was a poster or a.
See, that was 1969.
69, yeah.
Yeah, he's commissioner of athletics then. Bert was, and I was officiating, and he was a good friend.